Hello everyone and welcome to the latest edition of the First Thursday Club from RSK Biosensors. My name is John Davis. I'm a director at RSK Biosensors and at RSK Wilding, and I'm very happy today to be introducing you to our talk, which is all about preliminary ecological appraisals, excuse the hideous pun in our title. And this is a really interesting subject to talk about, I think, because every consultant, ecological consultant, will be used to doing PEAs, and every developer will be commissioning them, so they get done an awful lot. And the question really is, how much are we really thinking about it? Is it too much the case that we just churn them out because we're used to doing them, and are we doing them, too much or too little? So before I introduce you to the speaker, I will quickly run through the normal housekeeping slides. So all of you are muted, I'm afraid, so you can holler at the screen as much as you like and we won't hear you, but you can ask questions. So you have a box on the right of your screen, hopefully, which is a Q&A box. If you could pop your questions in there, I will run through those at the end. So we'll have about half an hour of the talk, and then about a quarter of an hour of questions. And our speaker today is I'm very grateful that he said he will follow up with any questions afterwards if we can't get through them all. You will also, by the way, get a feedback form at about an hour afterwards, and if you could fill that in, that would be brilliant, especially with ideas for future talks. So I will now introduce you to our speaker. So Robin, you can put your camera on so everyone can see you now. So Robin is a technical director at RSK Biosensors. He's been a consultant for at least 20 years. I'm sure it feels an awful lot more. And is a specialist in protected species licensing and mitigation. Is specifically water voles, reptiles, crested newts, badgers. Correct me if I'm wrong, Robin. But also through your work with many clients, you often do preliminary ecological appraisals, or at your level, you're reviewing PEAs, and that's what got you thinking about giving a talk.
That's right.
So I will hand over to you now to talk us through. You can turn your camera off, and I will too, and we'll see you on the other side.
Yeah, sure. So hi. So as John's introduced, we're here to talk about preliminary ecological appraisal today. The plan is I'll start by briefly describing what inspired us to run the talk. I'll just summarize what a PEA is, when I think it's appropriate to use one and when it isn't. We'll run through the content of a PEA in accordance with our industry guidelines. So whether you're commissioning a PEA or writing one, hopefully after listening to this, you'll have a bit more of an idea of what to look out for. And we'll also consider biodiversity net gain or net benefit assessment, and whether these should form part of an EIA, a PEA, or another part of the EIA process, and when it's appropriate and achievable at the PEA stage. So our initial thoughts behind the talk stemmed from a discussion within a group of staff here. Each person had been in the industry 15 years or more and had seen it all, but we'd all been observing the same phenomenon without really knowing when it started or why it was happening. We'd been seeing requests for preliminary ecological appraisals coming in left, right and centre, and though there were certain projects where we went on to undertake more detailed surveys and assessment, the feeling was that we weren't seeing the progression from initial appraisal to ecological impact assessment for planning submissions as frequently as we used to. Also, we'd observed that clients were specifically requesting a PEA, even in situations where we weren't really sure that PEA was the right approach. Sometimes perhaps it broadly was appropriate, but a really detailed PEA report probably wasn't warranted. So some of these examples would have been PEA requested for a small maintenance project that isn't part of the planning process. It's good to do an assessment, but is the full scope of a PEA really required? Others were where PEAs were being specifically requested to accompany a planning application. And I'll talk about in a minute, that's not what a PEA is intended to do. And then maybe most confusingly, we were asked to carry out preliminary ecological appraisals where existing ecological surveys had already been undertaken. So a recent example of this was a client who had already submitted a planning application. They'd already had an impact assessment, and they were busy doing other assessments, including HRA, and they needed to respond to the queries from a planning authority. So even though we hadn't been involved in that project before, I don't think what the client really needed was a preliminary appraisal at that stage. They already had enough information. Then finally, and this included some self-reflection, as John alluded to, we also realized that many PEA reports were increasingly long and unwieldy documents. Had we fallen into the trap of trying to make the PEA do more than it was intended to do? Whilst major projects have the potential to result in major impacts and will be subject to intense scrutiny, and those would clearly benefit from a very comprehensive initial appraisal, we weren't sure the same thing was proportionate for smaller, very much lower impact schemes. So PEAs are one of the basic building blocks of what we do as consultants, but they aren't the simplest thing to do. The field surveys require specialist skills in botany and a broad range of knowledge of protected and priority species. Considering how a development might result in adverse effects takes experience, and with the increasing focus on biodiversity net gain, there are other skills to be developed and involved in the process too, through the process of reporting, BNG, and in understanding what it takes for habitat creation to be effective. So before we go much further, I better get back to defining the term preliminary ecological appraisal. So SIEM, our industry body for ecologists, environmental managers, has published guidelines on undertaking preliminary ecological appraisal, first in 2012 and then revised to the current version in late 2017. They define a PEA as a rapid assessment of the ecological features present or potentially present within a site and its surrounding area, which it refers to as zone of influence, in relation to a specific project, usually development. So a PEA is intended to be brief or high level from an ecological perspective, while still being focused on a particular project. I believe their definition allows a considerable amount of variation between the content of PEAs intentionally, so that a PEA can be used to suit different scenarios. The question is then, is everyone on the same page when it comes to commissioning and delivering a PEA? Are we asking for and getting what we want? So I thought I'd run through what I feel should be included in a PEA and when it's what it is and what it isn't, basically. So preliminary ecological appraisal is intended for the client and the project team. It's intended to inform project design. If carried out in the design phase, the PEA can be a useful tool to help clients avoid impacts on valuable habitats or features used by protected and priority species. This is the first in the 4 steps of the mitigation hierarchy: avoid, mitigate, compensate, and enhance. But avoidance isn't just good ecological practice. There are other good reasons for doing so. Understanding how to avoid ecologically sensitive areas, by understanding that, developers can reduce risks, including risks associated with objections from public or neighbours, reducing the limitations imposed by consenting bodies or stakeholders, reducing the effect on programme associated with obtaining protected species licenses, for example, relation to bats or great crested newts, and reducing the risk of construction delays from seasonal constraints when implementing mitigation measures, such as translocating reptiles, which clearly can't be done during the hibernation period and limits that type of work to the summer window. A PEA should identify the likely ecological constraints and therefore give an indication of the likely mitigation measures which might be required. I say likely because at the earlier stage of a project, it may not necessarily be possible to be too definitive about these things. It should identify any additional surveys which may be required to fully assess ecological impacts, and also any opportunities for ecological enhancement measures. At this point in time, where the media and public's attention is usefully focused on the twin crises of climate and biodiversity, this is the first and sometimes only opportunity for a consultant ecologist to explore with their clients the options for ecological enhancement, habitat creation, and the integration of features to benefit biodiversity into their developments. So ecologists, we need to ask ourselves, if it's not us and it's not now, then who is and when are these things being raised? So if a PEA can do these things, what can't it do? A PEA is not intended for decision makers such as a planning authority. SIEM are quite explicit about this in their guidelines, and they state that a PEA report should not be submitted as part of a planning application unless it can be determined that a project would have no significant effects, no mitigation is required, and no further surveys are necessary. This is reinforced by the British standard BS 4 2020, which provides something of a framework for local authority ecologists and consultants to follow. It states, a PEA contains recommendations that further detailed surveys are necessary to inform a planning application, then this work should be undertaken before determining the planning application. And ideally, all survey information should be part of the application when it's first registered with the decision maker. So the level of survey effort, almost always a single visit, intended to form a PEA can't be expected to confirm the presence and absence of all protected species, for example. The seasonal constraints associated with surveying different species mean it won't always be possible to do this. And many species require more than one survey to produce valid results. For example, a reptile survey needs multiple visits to give us confidence that reptiles aren't present. And as we've said, a PEA can only report the likely constraints and impacts until the development design has been frozen and all further surveys completed. This means that at this stage of the process, it will be rarely sufficient to define all of the mitigation, compensation, enhancement measures that the planning authority would wish to see as they grant consent. I'd explain ecological assessment to be a continuum from very brief consideration of legal constraints at the least complex end through to a really complex ecological impact assessment as part of an environmental statement. Preliminary ecological appraisal can be used to describe anything in the first half of that continuum, covering projects which are not subject to a consenting process. One example of this would be small-scale maintenance work, say replacement of 50 meters of drainage pipe. For a larger project though, and those which require some form of consent, formal consent, PEA is relevant, but only up to the point at which those designs are confirmed and there is enough information that impacts can be assessed. Once we reach that point, we're in the realms of ecological impact assessment, over to the right. What I'd describe as a full or detailed PEA is suitable at the early stage of a planning project. It will encompass a comprehensive desk study, a field survey, including habitat mapping, and consideration of the suitability for protected or priority species. Typically, this will be written up into a preliminary ecological appraisal report, sometimes referred to as a PEA-brained. For these projects, though, do you always need a detailed PEA report? I would say the answer is no, not really. You could hold that report and go straight to ECIA, Ecological Impact Assessment. But you must acknowledge that there's still a need for that initial survey, followed by the recommendations and any further surveys that may be needed. So while you may not need a PEA report for every project, the process will remain broadly the same. Regular contact between your client and your ecologist will ensure that the findings of the initial survey visits are communicated well, they can be discussed, and those can be, any further surveys may be undertaken and mitigation measures developed together and turned into commitments for that ecological impact assessment. Some of the other alternatives to a full PEA report I've also shown here. I'll just run through them briefly. So an ecology checklist. Some planning authorities provide a pro forma, which allows planning applicants to review basic ecological information That will then determine whether a further assessment is required. So often that ecology checklist, it comes under the heading of preliminary ecological appraisal, but it may not need to be done by a technical specialist, a consultant. It could be done by the applicant. Ecological constraints assessments, that's a different scenario. That would be prepared by a consultant if the client's sole requirement is to avoid an offence. So they have consent, the works are going ahead, but they need to ensure they don't have a breach of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, for example. So there, your consultant should focus only on the legal requirements, such as examining the likely presence of a protected species or invasive non-native species in their site. So an example of that type of project is something very small scale, something such as say where small scale veg clearance is needed to access a piece of infrastructure to maintain that infrastructure. So it doesn't require detailed consent, it's all permitted, but it's taking the right precautions. An ECOP is an ecological constraints and opportunities plan. That's something endorsed both by SIEM in their guidelines and also the British standard for 2020. What that is a map or diagram showing the constraints and opportunities on a site. It's not necessarily a light touch. It may require quite a bit of that, it would require, or that initial survey work to determine what those constraints are, and it would need to consider what the impacts of that development are. But it's a nice, simple graphical way of sharing that information with a relevant group of people, such as the project design team and client. So it's a really useful addition, sometimes in addition to a PEA report. And then I've also included ecological appraisal over there on the boundary between PEA and ecological impact assessment. This is where, if we know there's no further surveys required, if we can tell even at that early stage that there are no major constraints, no major impacts, no major mitigation measures to be implemented, we could simply produce a single standalone document. It's not preliminary, it's gone a bit further than that, but it's not the full impact assessment. So I'm just going to revise a few of these key differences between PEA and impact assessment. I'll do that here. So PEAs are suited to the design phase where things are still changing. Impact assessments are once the design is fixed and there is no further change. Preliminary ecological appraisal discusses the likely impacts, but by the time we get to impact assessment, those impacts are certain. And we can characterize those impacts and describe them in technical ways in terms of their permanence, their scale, and so on. At PEA, further surveys will probably be required, whereas at impact assessment, all baseline data will need to have been collected. Mitigation will be recommended in the PEA, whereas in the impact assessment, it becomes a commitment that the client must agree to, that they put forward to their planning authority. So their PEA is for the project team, whereas the impact assessment is produced for the consenting body. PEAs could be produced for a variety of different reasons, from minor projects through feasibility of a project, scoping, a more detailed assessment, or as due diligence to assess whether a project that hasn't started yet or a site that hasn't been purchased yet is suited to the proposed development. And impact assessments are to provide assurance to the planning authority or consenting body that what is going to be done, what is said is what will be done, and therefore that the impacts can be, the assessment of impacts can be fully trusted. So where do we start? We start with collecting data. Every PEA will start with a desk study of some form. It'll review the development proposals, review the mapping, scheme maps, design maps, ordnance survey maps, and aerial photographs. If you're lucky, your ecologist might have done this at the tender stage. They'll have been trying to get a feel for the size of the site and the complexity of the habitats at that stage, but it needs to be done in a bit more detail now. The same definition that we read at the start refers to zone of influence. And we need to think about how the development proposals could affect ecological receptors on site and outside the site. So they may be upstream or downstream on a watercourse. There could be fragmentation effects of the development on hedgerows and woodlands. We might need to think about whether we need to survey off-site ponds, which may be used by amphibians that are resident on our site. This will inform the lengths we go to obtain more information about the habitats and species which might be affected by the project. So the next level is to go to a data search. And here you could expect a consultant to advise that the search should extend to around 1 kilometre. Although for the smallest of schemes where the zone of influence is not considered to extend beyond the site boundary itself, then a desk study is unlikely to be necessary. At the opposite end of the scale, of course, larger schemes, especially those which may result in habitat fragmentation or which may impact on species using internationally important sites, a larger search radius will be appropriate. The first thing we'll look for in that data search will be statutory designated sites. These are internationally and nationally important sites for nature conservation, such as Ramsar sites or SSSIs. In the projects that I work on, we typically use Magic, the DEFRA website, to search for these things, and it's open to anyone to search. If you don't have coverage in your area, for example, Nature Scot provides additional resources in Scotland, and SIME provides advice on all the data sources which are relevant in their guidelines on PEAs. Non-statutory sites, such as sites of importance for nature conservation, are designated at the local authority level, and they may not be available on the national web-based resources. So information on their location and boundaries may need to be obtained directly from an LPA or by purchasing data from a local environmental record centre. Species records can also be obtained by purchasing them from the record centre, although there are two lessons to bear in mind about species data, and that's just because there are records doesn't mean the species is present on site. And just because there aren't records doesn't mean the species isn't present on site. So it's useful, but it doesn't replace the comprehensive field survey. The field survey of a PEA will typically be limited to the site boundary, but if we consider the zone of influence properly, we may choose to extend it even at the PEA stage to collect additional data. Two common examples would be to extend the survey of for badger sets up to land up to, say, 30 meters from a boundary, just in case there is a set over the boundary which we might impact by our works. And we might consider the presence of ponds, which may be suitable for great crested newts at greater distances than this, if your consultant deems that habitat suitability index assessment, for example, might be needed at the PEA stage. In particular, it's often useful to search maps and aerial photographs for water bodies, to give an idea of the presence of great crested newt breeding sites. And to do that before the field survey is definitely an advantage, to make sure nothing obvious on a map is overlooked when your team are on site. So the field survey then. Field survey should include habitat mapping. Many consultants will use UK HAB methodology for this, as it links well to the use of the BNG Biodiversity Net Gain statutory metric in England. Although phase 1 survey methodology has been used for decades and it's still widely referenced. Indeed, with some recent experience where NRW has asked us to carry out phase 1 rather than UK HAB surveys, as in Wales, the statutory metric isn't adopted. Habitat condition assessments. This is necessary for sites that do require biodiversity net gain assessment in accordance with the statutory metric. But it's worth saying that it's also likely to prove useful as a starting point for other biodiversity assessment methods. Habitat surveys are a specialist task and require botanical expertise. In some situations, in certain habitats and in the winter months, it may not be possible to make a complete assessment of habitat condition. So you might expect further surveys to inform biodiversity assessments to be a recommendation of your PEA. The habitat survey should be used to identify valuable habitats, for example, priority habitats. Those are on the government's published list of habitats which they consider to be principal importance for conserving or enhancing biodiversity. And the last point on the slide, assessing the suitability of the site for protected and priority species. So it's unlikely that our survey will allow a confirmation of presence and absence from a single visit, but we should be able to identify the features of the site which are likely to be used by those species, any species which are expected to be resident, or use the site seasonally, for example, as a breeding site or hibernation site. The context of the site will be relevant here too, including understanding how the site's connected ecologically to the surrounding landscape. So there's no single source of guidance to undertake this part of a survey. It's sometimes referred to as extended phase 1 survey, with the species survey being the extension to the habitat survey of phase 1. But it's an exercise that requires broad knowledge covering all of the species which might be present in a given area or using a given habitat type. And sometimes local knowledge really helps with this as well. There's one aspect of the field survey I haven't actually included here. I should have also included invasive non-native species such as Japanese knotweed or Himalayan balsam. Our PEA should map the presence of those where possible. But it's not something that can be done at all times of year. So your consultant will advise whether or not it's possible. And if it hasn't been possible, then that is likely to be a survey also that's recommended in the outcome of the PEA. So with desk study and field surveys complete, we can move on to appraising the site and the development and identifying the potential constraints and opportunities. So identifying the potential constraints involves weighing up the likelihood that the development will result in an adverse effects on the nature conservation status of the receptor, the species or the habitat or the site. And weighing up the likelihood that it will result in an offence, so in relation to a protected species, say killing or injuring, or the spread of invasive species. In contrast to ecological impact assessment, there won't be a detailed characterization of impacts because it's likely that further information would have been needed to inform a comprehensive assessment. For example, the confirmation of the presence of the species and its relative population size. Next, we move on to providing recommendations. These will be in relation to further ecological surveys necessary to rule out each potential constraint, or to collect more data about that constraint. The need for more detailed assessment, for example, ecological impact assessment, maybe habitats regulations assessment, a parallel process, or another consent which might be needed, for example, assent from the statutory nature conservation body for a particular SSSI. And we'll provide recommendations for those mitigation measures. In contrast to impact assessment, it's likely there won't have been any discussion with the client in relation to these because this is the first communication or report prepared for the client. So these will be high-level recommendations. They'll try to cover all bases, but they won't be specific and they won't be commitments at this stage. The key point about recommendations within a PEA, I think, is that they must include clear justification. It's not acceptable for an ecologist simply to state a great crested newt survey is needed and that it's got to be done between certain months, April and June, but the PEA should explain that the information gathered is not sufficient yet to inform an assessment. It's not sufficient yet to inform a license application, if that were going to be necessary, or that the the surveys could not sufficiently or with sufficient reliance rule out the presence of that species, so that we can confirm that there are no offences likely. It should also explain, of course, why the ecologist thinks that the species in question that needs a survey might be present, and whether that's part of the site, a certain area, a certain type of habitat. And as we mentioned before, identification of opportunities. So there many sites, not all, I agree, but many sites will have opportunities to improve nature conservation status of a site or of a particular species. Building on this, I'll move on to the statutory biodiversity net gain and where that fits to the PEA process. As most of you will know, changes brought about by the 2021 Environment Act now mean that Town and Country Planning Act projects are required to deliver a minimum 10% biodiversity net gain. Nationally significant infrastructure projects going through the DCO process are not currently required to deliver net gain, but this will become a requirement next year. For any of these projects, it's important to consider net gain as early in scheme development as possible, as it can affect the viability of a project. Considering whether the area available on site for habitat creation and enhancement and incorporating these into the development design will be the cost-effective solution. But where there is no space to achieve this, then offsetting will be necessary, and the costs associated with this will need to be factored into project budgets. So what can we do at the PEA stage? We can map the habitats in UKHab and calculate the baseline biodiversity units on site using the biodiversity metric. The small sites metric is available for smaller projects, covering all bases there. In Wales, where the approach is slightly different, focusing on net benefit for biodiversity, a PEA will still be similar. Using the statutory metrics condition assessment might be considered a useful starting point, but there will be no calculation of value using biodiversity units. There's more emphasis on priority habitats and certainly upon species in Wales. And within the PEA, consideration will be need to be given to whether further surveys are needed to develop a plan for net benefit, addressing the DECA criteria. That's diversity, extent, condition, connectivity, and aspects of ecosystem resilience. These 5 attributes are prescribed by the Environment Wales Act. At the PEA, we can use the proposed development outline to provide provisional post-development habitat creation or other enhancement recommendations. We may be able to estimate the habitat, the losses in biodiversity in units based on scheme design if it's that far advanced at this stage, and we can use that to inform the scheme design to reduce or entirely avoid the need for offsetting. The PEA report can include a section on biodiversity calculations, habitat creation enhancement recommendations, but SIEM suggests a separate BNG feasibility report may be appropriate. I'd recommend that separate report will probably be necessary for major schemes where delivery of net gain may be at a large scale or be particularly complex. But for minor projects at the PEA stage, it's certainly acceptable to include the feasibility information within the PEA. Whether it is included or not included in the PEA report, the document has to acknowledge any limitations in the level of survey data collected at this stage and identify any further survey requirements necessary to make full biodiversity net gain net benefit assessment. So permitted developments, maintenance projects which fall outside the planning process are not legally required to deliver net gain, but it may still be helpful to explain schemes in BNG terms. Where we are preparing PEAs for these types of projects, we know that certainly there are some companies seeking to deliver net gain as early as they can. There's a couple of examples here. Network Rail, their biodiversity policy requires their projects to deliver no net loss as of this year, and they're expecting their projects, even those small non-planning projects, to achieve 10% net gain by 2035. National Grid already seek a 10% minimum net gain, but I understand that projects receive financial incentives if they can exceed that 10%. So what should I be looking for in a PEA? So if you're commissioning a PEA and you receive it and you want to know what you should be looking for, these two references, these two documents prepared by SIME form the sort of framework for consultants to produce PEAs. The first being about the process, and the second providing a template for PEA reports. We'll try and get the links to these documents in the meetings chat so that they're accessible. So what makes a good PEA? It should have clear objectives, clearly presented. The content of it should be appropriate. It should be proportionate to the scale of project that we're dealing with, not something massively complex for a small project and not something too brief for a complex project. It should explain the methods undertaken. I'd always endorse referencing the guidelines that have been followed if your consultant has followed guidelines. If there were no specific guidelines for a particular element, they should explain what they've done. And in particular, they should consider what the survey limitations have been. So whether those might have been access or timings that meant a species couldn't be surveyed effectively, that should all be presented. The PEA should reference the development proposals at the stage that the PEA was undertaken. We all know developments go through design change, and it's important to know when we go back to a PEA, what point was the development at that stage, how much information was known about it. They should refer to legislation and corporate or planning policies as far as they're relevant, and that means that the recommendations in those reports should referencing the reasons why they should provide justification for any recommendations they make, whether it be further surveys, further assessment, licensing, or so on. And finally, what should you do with your PEA? So your ecologist has produced it, it's arrived in your inbox. I'd urge you to read it, maybe challenge it, read it with enough detail that you know what its implications are, and challenge those recommendations, and meet with your consultant to discuss it so that all of the aspects can be clearly understood. The PEA is for the client, as we've said. It's got to inform you. If it's not what you're expecting, or you didn't need it in a report format, then you can ask for it in whatever format you prefer. The ecological constraints and opportunities plan I mentioned a few slides ago, that's a great way to summarize these issues. I would consider what to do next. So you'll certainly want to share it with your clients or contractors and your design team. You want to see if those retained habitats can be incorporated in the design, which may reduce risks, it may reduce costs associated with providing net gain. You should proceed with any further surveys, such as present substance surveys, that have been recommended, because the earlier those can begin, the sooner you'll have the data needed to assess impacts and go through to planning consent if that's what you need. Your ecological impact assessment, as I say, that's the next step. In relation to net gain, you'll be looking to produce a biodiversity net gain design stage report. That's in parallel with the impact assessment. So that's the next step of that process. And you can explore any opportunities there are for your achieving your 10% net gain or more on site or with offsetting. So that wraps up my summry today. I'll hand back to John, I think.
Brilliant. Yep.
We'll go
If
through
you want to stick your camera on, Robin, you've cunningly gone over by 12 minutes, which means you've got about 3 minutes for questions, which I'm sure isn't at all deliberate.
Oh, well, that's.
But as we said at the start, you'll happily respond to any other questions that we don't get to. So I will go straight onto those very quickly. So you mentioned a site where you were asked to quote for a PEA, but you found out an ECIA had been done already. If the ECIA was out of date, what sort of report would you recommend in those circumstances?
Yeah. I don't think I'd necessarily be recommending a report there. I think one thing to note, and there's some guidance on this, again, by SIAM, I keep referring to them. There's guidance on how long a report should remain valid. In most cases, we'd expect a report to be valid for at least a year or more. So if you're within that timescale, you probably don't need to repeat anything. Once you get to 18 months, a bit longer, at that point, you need an ecologist to probably revisit the site, just do a quick ground truthing. But I wouldn't expect them to prepare, certainly a PEA. It may just be a case of updating that report or writing for example, a letter to the planning authority confirming that it's been reviewed and remains valid at that stage. It should be a light touch unless something major has changed. Yeah.
Apologies, Robin, I'm hurrying you because we don't have much time. So I want to get through a couple more questions before we finish. Should specific surveys for species such as ground level tree surveys for bats be included in PEA? I've seen some examples which include them and others which don't.
Yeah, okay. So that one comes down to the scale of project. I would say where we can, we should be including any surveys that can be delivered in the day of. Most PEAs are done in a day or a large site over a single visit to the entire site. And sometimes if there's one or two trees, you might do your bat surveys of trees, your ground level tree assessments on that visit. However, if you've got large numbers of trees, if you've got a woodland, whatever, you can't, that's just not feasible. So it comes down to what's achievable within the timescale. Things like HSI, sort of quick habitat assessments for great crested newts, they could be done in most cases. But yeah, depends on what's there.
Okay, what's the difference between a PEAR and an ECOR? I'm not sure what an ECOR is, or is that an ECOP, maybe? Do you know what an ECOR is? Constraints and Opportunities Report, maybe? So you talked about the ECOP as being more of a map and a plan and a rough indication, didn't you? Whereas
so the ECOP, if we mean ECOP, the plan, Ecological Constraints and Opportunities Plan, it is at that PEA level where it's preliminary, it's the kind of first look, it provides information for the design team. You've got an area of species-rich grassland in one corner of the site, and we can try and design that to be within the retained habitats rather than lose that and then need to create it elsewhere. It's got that kind of high-level overview. It's certainly a useful thing to put on a table in a meeting with your client to discuss the site and what the issues are. The difference, I think you said difference between ECIA. So ECIA is that
no, PEAR.
Oh, PEAR. So a PEAR is the report. Yep. It's a text document. It will have all of those methods and the results and the recommendations outlined within it. The ECOP might form part of that, or it might be separate. And the PEAR is generally for the slightly larger projects, I would say.
Right, I'm going to clump the last two questions into one, and I'll probably answer them myself because they're to do with BNG. Excellent. So you're off the hook. So what level of baseline assessment is generally considered adequate to inform the small sites metrics? That's BNG, e.g. for small householders. And the other question, which was similar, which is with regards to BNG, would you recommend use of the small sites metric if possible, or use statutory metric, whatever size of site? So for the small sites metric is indeed, as it says, for smaller sites, and the metric is designed to be easier and simpler and more pragmatic and proportionate. So yes, I definitely would recommend it. It's the same sort of a survey, so it would be a very quick, if it's a small site, very quick UK HAB survey. So you're using the same methodologies, the same information that goes into the metric, but it just doesn't need such a for a small site, you don't need to collect so much data. So the small size metric has been designed specifically to make the whole process more pragmatic at that stage. There are a couple more questions, but I'm afraid we don't have time. So Robin, I will ping those over to you and make sure you answer those. We are a little bit over, so apologies for those, and hope we haven't lost too many people. Just a reminder that there will be a feedback form coming to you in about an hour's time. Also, next month, Mark Tomlinson from our aquatics team is going to be talking about biomanipulation of fish stocks in relation to improving the water quality and biodiversity of lakes. So sadly, no atrocious pun in the title as we had for this one. Thank you. Thank you so much for today, Robin. Really excellent, very thorough. I think everyone has a good idea of what needs to be in and not in a PEA going forward. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you everyone else for your time this lunchtime, and see you next month. Bye everyone.
Bye for now.